Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey, and I'm a current Master of Social Work student at Wilfred Laurier. This evening, I'm so excited to welcome you all to our film screening event for the film It Takes a Riot, Black Histories, Black Futures, and Community Organizing. This is a collaborative event in honor of Black History Month with Wilfred Laurier's Faculty of Social Work and the University of Toronto Factor-Inwentash School of Social Work and Dalla School of Public Health. So before we proceed our event, we want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we live and work is Indigenous territory. We are quite dispersed today geographically. Many of us at Wilfrid Laurier live and work on the lands of the Anishinaabe and the Haudenosaunee traditional land and the neutral peoples. And our colleagues at University of Toronto live on what is known as the traditional land of Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, our collective meeting places are still home to many Indigenous people, and we are so grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. So this territorial acknowledgement, I want to say, while symbolic, is not enough. Beyond our acknowledgement, we endeavor to be accountable to the colonial processes by which we came to live on this land that have caused and continue to cause harm to Indigenous peoples. As individuals who benefit from the occupation of this land on which we are located, we have a responsibility to continuously frame our work through a decolonial lens, to constantly educate ourselves, and to continue to take meaningful and intentional steps towards reconciliation. We want to position ourselves in this discussion by saying that we are settlers who live and have homes at the cost of Indigenous lives, sovereignty, and theft of Indigenous lands. We also want to share that we are grateful. We are very grateful for the ways in which this land nourishes us, the way water holds space for us, and all living creatures around it. All that water does for us without expecting anything in return. We are grateful for how land nourishes us physically and emotionally as well. So a land acknowledgement is an important way of beginning all our work, and specifically this conversation on racism, as we recognize the injustices wrought upon Indigenous communities here. And as we attempt to enhance our understandings of the interlocking nature of oppression and the shared histories and struggles, specifically of Black and Indigenous communities. Land acknowledgements call our attention to the colonization of these lands and disrupts white supremacy and white supremacist notions of European dominance. So as we move forward in today's event, as well as all gathering here in and out, remember that we are all treaty members. Thus, we must strive to act in solidarity and build reciprocal relationships with Indigenous communities. So we are so glad you could all join us here today for this event, and I would like to introduce the panelists and our intrepid host, Ezzy, who will be facilitating the panel discussion after the screening. So I'm just gonna take this time to introduce the amazing panelists and our host, Ezzy. So Ezzy is a Nigerian-born writer, student support specialist, and anti-racist practitioner based in Toronto. Her work, whether fiction or nonfiction, focuses on themes of identity, culture, gender, race, health, and intimacy. Ezzy's work has been featured in several journals, including Room Magazine and Arc Poetry Magazine, and recently released a museum exhibition at the Agnes Athurigan Tin, sorry if I messed that up, Art Center. Ezzy holds a master's degree in education and honors Bachelor of Science from the University of Toronto. During her degree, she specialized in global health, human biology, English, and education, doing research on race, Black feminism, anti-colonialism, and radical possibilities for global health. So that is our host. And now I want to just move forward in introducing our amazing panelists that you will hear from later on tonight. Tennille Warren. She's our first panelist. She goes by they, them. Tennille is a non-binary, queer, Black, immigrant, identifying, intersectional, equity educator and consultant. They have worked in a nonprofit leadership and program development for more than a decade. As an intersectional equity educator, Tennille delivers trainings, creates policies, and guides diversity and equity and inclusion strategic planning across sectors. They are currently the Equity and Inclusion Officer for the Waterloo Region District School Board. Their clients have included KPMG Youth, the City of Waterloo, Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation, District of Niagara School Board, and Toronto District School Board, Wilfred Laurier University, and the University of Waterloo, to also name a few. Tennille holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Guelph and a Bachelor's of Arts in Media Communications from the University of the West Indies. So this is the amazing Tennille. Hi, Tennille.
Hi, Audrey. Thank you for having me.
No problem. Next, our second panelist is Jessica Hutchinson. Her pronouns are she, her. Jessica Hutchinson is a white settler activist scholar pursuing her PhD in social work at Wilfred Laurier University. Her research explores how strip searching in women's prison is a form of sexist, misogynoir, and colonial genocidal sexual violence. She has been a prisoner's rights advocate for nearly 15 years and teaches in social work and critical criminology. Jessica is also a project coordinator with the Center for Indigeology at Laurier and is deeply committed to dismantling colonial and racist systems that perpetuate harm and violence. So this is our amazing Jessica Hutchinson. Hi, Jessica.
Thanks so much, Audrey. Glad to be here.
And so our third panelist is Wambai Karanja, PhD, Social Justice Education Department, Ontario Institute of Studies in Education, OISE at the University of Toronto. So Wambai is a PhD candidate in the Department of Social Justice Education, OISE at UFT. Her research interests are in decolonizing theories of land and education, African and diaspora studies, indigeneity and indigenous epistemologies, international development theories, law, feminist theorizing grounded in decolonial, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and Afrocentric frameworks. Wambai is a foreign-trained lawyer and currently works in the nonprofit executive management sector. She has published in the areas of land, indigenous epistemologies, and decolonization, and is interested in critical and resistant scholarship and discourse that move beyond theory to praxis in education. So this is Wambai, our next panelist. Hi, Wambai. Thank you. So lastly, our final panelist is Dr. Simon Black, who is a professor at Brock University. He writes and speaks on work and labor, cities, social inequality, and social movements. He is an award-winning teacher and author of Social Reproduction and the City, Welfare Reform, Childcare, and Resistance in Neoliberal New York, and also the creator of this film. So the film we're about to watch today, I have personally watched it several times, is a riveting and eye-opening film about Black resistance in Canada, specifically in Ontario, co-produced by Simon Black and Adil Abdullahi. So I'm going to just turn it over to you, Dr. Simon, to introduce the film for us this evening.
Thank you, Audrey, and good evening all. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me to share this film with you and to my fellow panelists for our conversation to come. It Takes a Riot, Race, Rebellion, Reform is a product of a collaboration between myself, my co-producer, Dr. Adil Abdullahi of X University, formerly Ryerson University, and my friend, Howard Grandison, a Brooklyn-based film director. The project received generous funding from the Social Justice Research Institute at my home institution of Brock and the Akua Benjamin Legacy Project at X University. The Legacy Project was instituted by X University's former president, Sheldon Levy, to honor the tremendous contributions of activist, academic, and community leader, Dr. Akua Benjamin, who is featured in the film. Dr. Benjamin is one of the founders of the Black Action Defense Committee, a civil rights group and police and criminal justice watchdog founded by members of Toronto's Black communities, including by the late Sharona Hall, Charlie Roach, and Dudley Laws. It was for the second annual Akua Benjamin Public Lecture in 2017 that the film was commissioned. And that second annual lecture happened to fall in May 4th to be exact. May 4th, 2017 marked the 25th anniversary of what some call the Yonge Street Riot, but what we as filmmakers and Dr. Benjamin herself prefer to call an uprising or a rebellion. The uprising began as a peaceful protest march organized by the Black Action Defense Committee, or BADC. It was organized to protest the deadly police shooting of a young unarmed Black man by the name of Raymond Lawrence on May 2nd, 1992 in Toronto, and also to protest the April 7th acquittal by an all-white jury of 2 police officers who were charged in the 1988 shooting death of unarmed Black teenager Michael Wade Lawson. And finally, the march was an act of solidarity with the rebellion in Los Angeles, which followed the acquittal just days before of 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers in the brutal beating of an African-American man by the name of Rodney King. As with any documentary, the film has a particular narrative and a set of arguments that it seeks to convey to its audience. History, of course, can be interpreted in multiple ways, and we as filmmakers and those folks featured in the film have our own interpretations of the events of May 4th, 1992. As was the case with this film, documentary filmmakers are often confronted with an abundance of materials from which they build a narrative: archival TV footage, newspaper clippings, interviews, and the interpretations and narratives of others who have documented the same history. In the case of the Yonge Street Uprising, this includes the playwright Andrew Moody and his 1998 play Riot, the MC and spoken word artist Motion Wendy Braithwaite, who's featured in the film, the brilliant poet and writer Dion Brand, scholars such as Rinaldo Walcott, and the late Austin Clarke, whose red-hot response to the uprising, Public Enemies, Police Violence in Black Youth, was published in the summer of 1992. More recently, my co-producer Idil Abdullahi's book with Rinaldo Walcott, Black Life, Post-BLM and the Struggle for Freedom, also delves into this history. It's a book I highly recommend. So out of all this, we had to come up with a roughly 30-minute documentary. Our budget allowed for a 15 documentary short, but we stretched our resources. We were always clear that our effort was to tell a history of the Yonge Street Uprising, not the history. The film has been screened in both community and university settings, and it was always our intention to make it available as a public resource. And as of this month, it can be watched on Vimeo and is available through most university libraries. In the wake of the mass mobilizations for racial justice in the summer of 2020 and calls to defund the police, we hope the film ultimately provides some insights, some answers to the question of what does it take for Black people to get justice in this society.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I'm now going to pass it over to Ezzy, our host, who will begin us off with the question and answer period with the panelists.
Thank you, Audrey. And thank you, Simon, and welcome to everyone who is joining us today. The film ended on such a poignant note, especially, as we reflect on kind of the life of Elder Hooks as well. And so maybe I'll just kind of read her definition or their definition of love, right? So for Bell Hooks, as they wrote, love is a combination of care, commitment, knowledge, responsibility, respect, and trust, right? And she borrows Fromm's kind of definition of what love is. And she says that love is the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own and another's spiritual growth, right? And the spiritual beyond kind of what we think about in terms of the religious or even the kind of neo-spiritual that we kind of see more prevalently today, but also in terms of the spirit work that we do, right? And how we extend ourselves into community. So that's such a perfect note to end on. As we go into kind of our first question, which is, what is the work that you do? What is your vision for anti-racist practice? What do you believe is the role of education? We heard about education in the film, right? In terms of decolonizing practices and progressions in areas of social justice and racial equity. So a big question. And since we are having the chat open, I'll also ask our co-facilitators in the background to post some of the questions in the chat as we go, so you can see what the question is. But I'll start with Simon, since we just watched your brilliant contribution. So go ahead and take the first shot at the question.
Thanks, Ezzy. That's a big question, then. Let me start by saying I want to kind of historicize anti-racist practice, because that's part of the question. You know, in various historical moments, anti-racist practice has meant or has been understood as meaning anything from fighting fascists and neo-Nazis in the streets to sabotaging infrastructure in an apartheid state, as the armed wing of the ANC did in the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, to peaceful demonstrations against racist policing. You know, but today, anti-racist practice has come to include a diversity workshop for corporate executives. You know, what book shot to the top of the bestsellers list in the wake of the murder of George Floyd? It was Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility. I mean, DiAngelo made a living prior to writing the book of doing anti-racism training in the private sector. I think we're in a moment today in which, you know, a corporation like Amazon can be in support of Black Lives Matter, while at the same time crushing a union drive led by Black workers at its warehouse in Alabama. Nike can do a campaign with Colin Kaepernick while doing nothing about the appalling working conditions of racialized women in the global South who make their sneakers. Politicians, including our own Prime Minister, can kneel, take the knee and call themselves anti-racist, but support the construction of pipelines being built through unceded Indigenous territory. I see no need in dismantling the temporary foreign worker program that strips Black and Latino migrant farm workers of their labor rights, and especially in the middle of a pandemic, and bristles at people calling Israel an apartheid state. So I think we desperately need to recover the radicality of anti-racism and anti-racist praxis. And while I think liberal versions of anti-racism, including EDI, may be important to struggles for recognition and representation, and is important to those struggles, I don't think they're adequate to the task of beating back the rising tide of white nationalism and neo-fascism. And so my vision of an anti-racist praxis is very much grounded in the Black radical tradition, my socialist kind of anti-colonial and feminist politics, and the kind of two sites of my praxis are both the university as a professor and the labor movement. And in both instances, education really is the process of raising awareness about how race and racialized forms of government and power are articulated with gender, with class, with sexuality, to structure economic and social life in very unequal ways, and how we collectively challenge this, right? Very important. But for me, what this education looks like on a picket line or in a union hall is very different from what it looks like in a fourth-year university seminar, but still being very rooted in the same vision of an anti-racist praxis.
I think you raised some very important points about the connectivity of what real anti-racist praxis actually is. It can't just be the kind of temporary display, right? It actually is kind of uprooting, going back to the root, you know, of the issues and being consistent. You know, just like you say, you can't have like a shoe campaign while the shoes are being made by those who are in terrible labor conditions, particularly those of racialized groups, right? And talking about how the power dynamics continue there. So let's take Wambuyi next. Wambuyi, what's the work that you do and what is your vision for anti-racist practice and how does education factor into that? Oh, you're on mute. Let's get you unmuted.
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, I think watching the movie and just listening to the different perspectives, what came to mind for me in terms of anti-racist practice is where it begins. Like what moves a person to get out from their homes or house to join a movement. And what is it that is in that person that really, how is that need invoked in a person? And I guess when I think about it, it begins with an awareness that there is a wrong committed against your person, against your being, and that you need to join with others who are facing similar challenges. So analysis practice for me starts from the self. It starts from that awareness, that space inside of you that resists the form of the necropolitics that are, or the necrophilia that is being perpetrated against you. And the need to, again, see how strength is in the solidarities you have with those that are equally persecuted as yourself. And then a thousand selves coalesce to form what I would call a movement. And then that begins the process of the social movementing itself, if there is a word like that. So I see that as the genesis. I totally agree with the former speaker that we have had a lot of examples of anti-racist practice and resist forms, all different kinds of forms of resistance. And there are a lot of course, lessons to be learned from each one of those movements. So I think that looking back to why I would want to be in a social movement, looking at and then being socially aware of what is happening, politically, economically, and ideologically, and how all those affect me personally, and by extension, I mean as an African person myself, I draw a lot from the Ubuntu philosophy of communityism, and of I am because you are, and because you are, therefore I am. So I am because you are with me. So I think there is that pull, innate pull in there.
I think, Wimble, you might have frozen.
To join together to form a social movement from the within, and it's portrayed outside. The age, and by education, I'm defining it very loosely because I don't think that the strength of what would constitute a social movement is going to come from the classroom. I think in my many years of education, I've never been taught anything about social movements. I did not encounter anything that would teach me how to do social movement work. I've learned it from observing those who look like me and those who resist oppression like me. So I think we have to look for education about social movements outside of the current education system, because it's definitely not meant to perpetrate or to forward any ideals that would support social movements in any way. Social movements are about resisting power, and education, the education system, for example, is the main epitome of how power is exercised in so-called democratic societies. So I think we have to look for education outside of the classroom to be able to advance our social movement work.
And it's good that you point that education does not just simply occur in the classroom. And in fact, the most transformative education, particularly in your experience, has occurred in the community spaces. And so Tennille and Jessica, both of you work quite intimately in those community spaces. So let's take Tennille first and tell us about kind of the work that you're doing and your anti-racist praxis vision, and then how does education factor into that?
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the education taking space outside of institutions. I work in the education system, and I'm always making a distinction between education and school, and that the school is an extension of the colonial practice, and that is why that system needs to be dismantled and rebuilt in order for it to be a space of learning and to truly create anti-racist, anti-oppressive, social justice-driven environments. And so when I think about my work and the work that Jessica and I do through Reallocate, that very much is about community gathering and what does resistance, uprising, rebellion look like in a modern context with different tools that are available to us. That's a part of the work that we do within our organization. And then from a personal standpoint, at the beginning, they talked about the brand of Canada. I always talk about brand Canada. And there's this quote that Trudeau has about diversity. Diversity is not just our strength, it's our competitive edge. I have no idea what that means. And so there's this language that I call ratio economics that seems to be very prevalent in systemic voices. And we're seeing that now, where anti-racism is a business. And I can say that as a consultant who quite often rejects clients. No, that's not what I do. And so with that, it becomes increasingly, well, you're not the person that gets recommended for particular things. And I find more and more people are like, I don't do that, because we have sanitized the work. And in the documentary, they mentioned the results after the Young Street Uprising, and one of them was that anti-racism policy for the Ministry of Education. And I will say that that is the best anti-racism policy that's ever come out of the Ministry of Education. And if you were to track the timeline from that policy till now, they have literally sanitized it with each round. And so that mention of a quarter century later, and so what we're seeing is this economizing of anti-racism? And so in order to get back to anti-racism practice, we have to get back to the streets. We have to get back to those collective conversations that are rooted in African knowledge ways, that are rooted in our ancestral Black knowledge ways, right? Because the system is a Eurocentric knowledge way. And so even as we have consultations around anti-racism and social justice practice, we are consulting against a whiteness paradigm. So even as we're trying to dismantle the system, we have to teach the system in a language that it understands. So if we're going to get back to the origins of anti-racist practice, we must do that outside of the system, in the streets, in the knowledges that the system has tried to colonize out of us. And I think the advantage of that multiculturalism brand that Canada has is that we have African identities like Wambulu who can access that directly. We didn't have that in the same way in 92, in 67. I'll go to Jamaica, where I'm from, in 38 with those riots. We did not have that direct contact that globalism gives us. So we have an access to those African knowledge ways that we did not have before. And so that anti-Black racist praxis means that we have to reconnect with the ways of collectivism that were colonized out of our bodies through enslavement and the plantocracy. So that's me.
So many good terms, so many strong terms in in what you've shared. The chat is going off in support of their use. And definitely Lissa Trotz calls the EDI industrial complex now, right? It's become its own kind of complex. And just as you, I also do consulting. And so just as you're saying, in terms of seizing power in kind of these operations as well, denying clients, right? You're not ready to do the work. And I, as also self-protection, am not ready to do the work with you. Right. So it's not simply letting everybody into the space all the time. And Jessica, let's let you have the final word on this question before we move on to the next one.
Yeah, thanks so much, everybody, for sharing so far. I think one of the ways in which I engage in this work is through the trying to expose and dismantle the colonial and anti-Black racist state violence in multiple different sectors. So a lot of my work is informed by direct advocacy and work with criminalized and imprisoned women and gender nonconforming people, specifically the folks who are imprisoned here at Grand Valley Institution for Women, which folks on the call might not know is here in Kitchener and is the largest federal prison for women in Canada. And we know that just recently, the Office of the Correctional Investigator, who is the Ombudsman for Federal Corrections in Canada, has released a report, his annual report, and he's stated that 50% of people incarcerated in women's prisons are Indigenous. So this is part of the colonial genocide against Indigenous peoples. And he also said in the same report that Indigenous and Black people across all prisons in Canada are overrepresented in the use of force. And use of force, the most common use of force is the use of pepper spray. And then we go, from there, different forms of physical and chemical violence. And my role was to go into the prison. I've spent hundreds and hundreds of hours inside Grand Valley Institution for Women, mostly in maximum security and segregation, where Black and Indigenous people are significantly overrepresented and incur serious forms of state violence. So gendered and anti-Black and colonial state violence. So part of my work is to work with people on an individual level, but to try to help them get out of those state-inflicted violent situations, trying to get them out of segregation, trying to get them out of what the prison system likes to call mental health monitoring. So when in the prison system, if you attempt suicide, you get sent to segregation, and they call it mental health monitoring. You're under surveillance 24 hours a day. You're not allowed to have human contact. So I would go in and be literally on my knees trying to speak to women who have just tried to kill themselves through their meal slot, trying to ask them, how can I help you? How can I get you out of this state-inflicted violent situation? And from there, my analysis and my work is heavily informed by the people I've supported and advocated with and for over the past 15 years. So I'm doing my PhD in social work at Laurier, and it's looking specifically at the use of strip searching in prison. So strip searching is the forced removal of clothing and performance of actions with intimate body parts under the threat of consequence in front of state agents. And I've spoken to 23 Indigenous, Black, and white women from across Canada who used to be in prison, and they unequivocally say that it is sexual assault. So women are experiencing this sexual assault, and then we have to put an analysis, an anti-racist and anti-colonial analysis to it. And if we think about sort of the gendered sexual violence that was used against Black women during slavery, and we think about the colonial sexual violence that is continued to be used against Indigenous women, we can see the links between strip searching and sexual violence and gendered and colonial sexual violence. So I'm trying to expose these acts that are just deemed as regular state practices in order to keep us safe. But we know that safety for who and what is safety to begin with. And the last thing I'll say before I zip my lips is that as a member of Reallocate Waterloo Region, which, as Tennille mentioned, we're a grassroots collective trying to dismantle white supremacist, anti-colonial state violent mechanisms and reallocating the resources that are spent on these systems, specifically policing. So we actively campaign to defund the police and to move these resources into the community, because as we know, as the film portrayed very well, is that Black people are significantly more likely to be targeted by state police violence. So we know here in Waterloo Region, Black people are 6 times more likely than white people to be inflicted with use of force against them by the police, and 14 times more likely than white people to be carded by the police. So we know that, anti-Black police violence continues to happen, and we advocate very strongly against it. To try to not only shift the financial resources from the police, but also our ideological belief that carceral policing logics and approaches are the ways to deal with social problems, because they're not. And we know that the institution of policing is firmly rooted in colonialism and anti-Black racism. Like, these histories are very well known, so we can't divorce them from what they were created to do in the first place. So I think I will leave it there for now.
Absolutely, and thank you for bringing up, that tied relationship between, settler colonialism and histories also of anti-Black violence. Andrea Smith writes about indigeneity, settler colonialism, and Orientalism and white supremacy in one of her papers, and talks about the fact that those things are kind of the pillars that are connected, that bring the white supremacist system that we see today. So now as we talk about kind of those intersections and where we come to these discussions and how those discussions are tied together, maybe we'll talk about our positionalities, right? And so we'll go to Simon to ask, as a white filmmaker and educator, how did you come to doing this work? What do you believe is the role of white people in anti-racist work? Since the death of George Floyd and what we call the season of anti-racism, right? We know we've been doing the work for forever, but some folks have just come to it, right? The season of anti-racism that we've recently seen. How have those responsibilities maybe shifted, if at all?
Yeah, that's a great question, a great set of questions.
Mm-hmm.
I came to anti-racist politics or radical politics really via two routes. One was the home. Growing up, I was taught the value of solidarity and to abhor racism and all the forms of social inequality. Second was really through hip hop, learning about the histories of Black struggles against racism by looking up the various names that were name checked by my favorite MCs. So, actually, when it came to my politicization as someone who considers himself radical, actually came to know, names like Malcolm X and Nelson Mandela long before I knew Karl Marx. But more recently, I come to this work as a scholar and as an activist interested in progressive social transformation more broadly, and as someone who teaches courses on racism and resistance. Second part of the question, what's the role of white people in anti-racist work? Here's the expected and kind of boilerplate answer now in some anti-racism spaces. White people must be allies in confronting and calling out racism of other white people and challenging the ways in which racism is produced and reproduced through institutions, whether those institutions are in the workplace or in the university, in the government, policing, and so on. I want to set aside for a second what I think is problematic about that term ally. Maybe we can get to that in the question and answers. It's not a term that I use. And I'm not minimizing this work. When this work is done, when it's done well and when it's done right, it's very important. It's very important to challenging racism, both systemic and kind of interpersonal racism. But as with the question of praxis, I think it depends on what one calls anti-racist work and which white people we're talking about. And this is the standard response really ignores questions of inequalities of class and power among white people. Like the owner of Fox News or the editor of the Toronto Sun who peddles in xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-Black racism is more powerful than the white worker who watches Fox News or reads the Toronto Sun. Now, that doesn't mean that a white person who holds racist opinions or is racist in their behaviors cannot cause harm. Of course they can. Harm at the ballot box in terms of who they vote for, harm in terms of the form of microaggressions wherever they work, harm in terms of actual physical violence, but they do not have the same power as the owner of Fox Corporation or the owner of the Toronto Sun. So the question is, why are the likes of Fox News and the Toronto Sun so invested in peddling in racism? And I think in this moment, we have to think about what is it that these powerful institutions have? Why are they so invested in racism? It's that what they fear most is a multiracial progressive movement for a more egalitarian distribution of wealth and power and political participation in our society. And this gets us all the way back to one of my favorite people to read and reread, W.E.B. Du Bois, who said that, as long as the white worker is more invested in whiteness than in solidarity with other working people, a movement like this, an egalitarian movement, can't really be built. So it's with building this kind of movement in mind that white people, such as myself in labor and in social movements, should be engaged in anti-racism work, not out of kind of guilt or some moral contrition about privilege, but because as Ruthie Gilmore puts it, when Black Lives Matter, everyone lives better. I think the moment of the Black-led multiracial uprisings that happened in the summer of 2020 following the murder of George Floyd saw a record number of people take to the streets in the name of racial justice, including white people who'd never been to a protest about racism before. So I think the question we now face is, and what I face in my own work, is how to sustain this momentum and how to think about further organizing and strategy.
Yeah, that's really important to think about. I like how you separated, you know, the kind of expected answer of we should all do it, you know, from what it actually means to think about power, which is at the base of kind of these logics of domination and oppression that really undergird what we're talking about, right? Racism is not simply about these individual encounters, but how the systems hold up kind of the hierarchies that we experience in our everyday lives.
Exactly.
So to Neil and Jessica, and we can start with Jessica this time. And this is kind of maybe a loaded question a little bit, since we just watched a film about riots and their riots, or rather uprisings, and their importance. But do you believe in riots, walk-ins, and other forms of demonstrations? Or rather, do you believe that they lead to any form of progressive change? So we'll take Jessica first, and then Neil after.
Is it okay, Neil, if you go first?
Okay,
sorry to throw it out of order.
Sure. Yeah, so this question, also, let me just say, it's really hard to not engage in conversation because like I have things I want to say to Simon. But anyways, like just riffing off of what he offered
you
to the space.
tie in to what Simon said. Go ahead. Be
but there are a couple of things I was thinking about, you know, coming to this question. The first thing is, you know, when you start to do the learning, because Simon talks about the history, and Jessica can tell you I'm a voracious reader. But one of the things that I've come to recognize is, and if you've read Horton Spillers, if you engage Audre Lorde's work, is that as we talk about anti-racism and going back to the streets, we're really talking about the gender binary as well, and that relationship. And I think a core component of breaking white supremacy and addressing racism is recognizing the relationship between racism and the gender binary, is recognizing that there was a racialized ungendering of Black and Indigenous bodies that resulted in the turning them into property. That again is the foundational fuel of the economy. So it's like that disconnect, I also think impacts the ways in which white bodies separate themselves from the work, and then they become allies and conspirators, because I'm of the opinion that in the battle against racism, I am the ally because I'm the victim. You hold the power, so you should be leading this work. You have that access into the system. I also don't like the word ally, but in terms of the level of this work, that positioning of that white person, because they are not Black, is problematic in the process of challenging anti-racism, because what it does is it creates an excuse for them to sit in their power and take their time to show up to the table. But to the work of riots and walk-ins and other demonstrations, I do not like the language of this question. But I understand I understand the intentionality behind using the language of that question, because as we look at the riots and the walk-ins and that historical language, what we're looking at is white supremacy defining the liberatory actions of Black bodies. And so we're talking about, is there a place for uprising? Is there a place for rebellion? Is there a place for liberation? Is there a place for movement? Absolutely, because there's nothing, and the documentary just proved it, there's not a single progress that takes place if the people do not revolt. The system, again, has not shifted from the plantation. It is still a plantocracy, and therefore nothing changes without revolt. It requires revolt. And when we know that we have achieved any type of disruption, any type of dismantling, is when the system does not demand the most marginalized body to revolt to get the most basic necessities for themselves. Right? And we're seeing an active demonstration. And I want to talk about that language, because here, when we're talking about this, being specific to ourselves and our own communities, when we say riots, but if you look at the language being used by the white supremacist movement right now, they're using the language of freedom. And if we look through history, if we look how that history is told of white violent movements, that is a language that they use. And then our movements are riots that break the system, right? So we need to analyze the language of white supremacy and how it reflects and comes back on us as harm. What we're doing is liberation. and it's called a revolt for a reason. Absolutely needs to be a revolt. And so there is not a single piece of paper or progress that has taken place in any office, in any building, that was not influenced by people walking into that street. Nothing has ever taken place just by walking and having conversations and several meetings. There's always been a requirement for revolt. We cannot separate the civil rights movement from the freedom riders and from the Salem March, no matter how many times Lyndon B. Johnson's name might be on that. But he didn't do that because he had a conversation with Martin Luther King. He did that because he needed the revolting to stop. So there's no movement without revolt.
Absolutely. And thank you for also offering that discussion about even the language of the question, right? And the importance of language. And I think that you also did it in a particularly inviting way that I think is important when we have community discussions like this, right? To understand where terms come from and their intent, but then also to push past intent, right? So Jessica, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for that, Tennille. The focus on the violence of language is really important to me. Thinking about how the white supremacist colonial language often works to hide the violence that is inherent in the practices and the behaviors that are taking place. So one of the things that I've been really thinking about lately, and Tennille and I have had several conversations about this, and the more I think about it, the more violent I think it is. And that is something that I think is actually working against Black uprisings, and that it's done by people like myself, white people who claim to be these allies. I too do not use the term ally. People claim to be engaging in anti-racist practice, but the ways that they do it, specifically through the use of toxic positivity. Toxic positivity is something that I see more and more happening online, particularly weaponized by white women. And not solely by white women, but speaking as a white woman, I see it. I see the weaponization of toxic positivity, and I firmly believe that it is a tool to maintain white supremacy and colonial systems. And, all of this framing of, well, you just, just think about it differently. Look at the positives of this, and also, look at the silver lining, or trying to fight against this white nationalist, white supremacist violence with just saying, we love you and we embrace you. That's not enough. We can't just tell, violent white supremacists that we love them and expect these structures, these centuries of white supremacist structures and anti-Black structures to just disappear. And I really have started to think about toxic positivity as undermining the lived realities of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, and anti-Black racism. So when we tell people who are experiencing anti-Black racism to just, put a smile on your face and just be bigger than everybody else, and pull your bootstraps up, that actually works to dehumanize Black people and does not allow Black people to be engaged fully with the rage, the grief, the sadness, the anger of being constantly under the systems of domination, oppression on a daily basis. So I feel that toxic positivity actually works to stifle these uprisings that need to happen, as Tennille has pointed out, because we can't seem to get these centrist, liberal, white people, white women, to actually go beyond just claiming to be anti-racist and claiming to do their work, because we're not moving far enough. They're not putting their bodies in the streets in a way that works to dismantle these structures. And I'm not saying that we know that, Ruthie Gilmore says, abolition is not just the tearing down of structures. It's actually the creation of the society that we want. It's not about absence. It's about presence. It's about love. Like, abolition is a labor of love. So what I'm not saying that love is not part of this, but what I am saying is that toxic positivity is a form of racial gaslighting. And then it's saying what you're feeling doesn't matter. What you're feeling, these centuries of white supremacy and anti-Black racism, doesn't actually matter. And it works to recenter white women and works to shield them from having to actually start to deconstruct the white supremacy within themselves. And for any of us, if any of us white people say, oh, I don't have a racist bone in my body, or I don't see color, well, we know right away that's a huge red flag, because it is not, white people are not engaging with the fact that we live in a white supremacist anti-Black society, and we have been embedded with structures of domination and oppression and anti-Black racism. So, we have to do the internal work to try to deconstruct and dismantle the structures of white supremacy within ourselves. And it's hard work, and white people don't like to do it. So they shield themselves by calling themselves an ally, by saying, I read Robin DiAngelo's book. Well, so what? Like, give me a break. Like, we have to be going beyond this. So that's what so to answer your question, yes, I firmly believe in uprisings and being on the street, and we need white people to be doing that. We can't just rely on, like Tennille said, the people who are the victims of these systems that are targeting them on a regular basis. We are the ones who have the power. We have the social capital. So we are the ones who actually have to put ourselves in these uncomfortable and risky situations, because the risk to me as a white woman is significantly reduced as a cis white woman than it is for Tennille. So we have to think about these things as white people, and to move beyond our own comfort and get into the streets.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I do see that we're running close to time. We will be getting at least 2 of your questions in at the end. So we'll take Wambuyi next, and then for the last question, we were going to pose it to everybody, but I think I'll pose it to just a couple. So Wambuyi, how do we build strong forward-moving movements? What is the key to establishing a positive community of action? And how do we protect our spirits while doing this work as students, activists, and people who want to work for change?
Wow, what a loaded question. I think just going back to what has been said before, there is definitely a need for social movements. I once had somebody say that power is very powerful. And when we look at the way power plays out, there's no single, power comes with resources, and power is about protecting resources from others. So I think when we think of riots and movements, they kind of resist power. They are a form of resistance to that power. And definitely, since power is never given out freely, there has to be resistance. What prompts that push that creates riots, because people have to defend themselves from the violence that goes with power. And when they resist power, the forces of the powerful are unleashed against them. I was thinking about when I was watching the video, I was thinking about the politics of space and place. These were people just sitting at a certain place in Toronto, just talking about how they're experiencing and making demands about what they needed. But the police came to them, in the horses came to them, and they had not gone to the police, they were just peaceful demonstrators, and then all this force with police horses and whatever was unleashed upon them. So the question blinks about who owns those spaces. How do we engage with the politics of space? Because power, again, is about removing people from certain spaces that need to be controlled. So I was thinking about how how people who are disenfranchised are not even entitled to space. And that goes again to the question of how resistance is policed in our communities, and the silencing that goes through the use of language. For example, I heard after the when there was the violence erupted, it was described the following day as a rampage. What was just people trying to go about their business was described as a rampage, which now invokes criminality within it. So that was very, very telling for me. So I think, like Taneo said, language, the way language is policed and the way language is used is very political in terms of what constitutes a riot. And sometimes even the word riot itself is politicized for certain political gains by the people who control what language means. So it is very important that we pay attention to how language is used in protest, and still claim that if we need to protest, and if whatever word it needs to be defined by, if that is what provokes the action that we need, we are still going to go ahead. So again, the language of deflecting from the main issue, that the following day reporting was about the rampage. It was not even about the issues that people are talking about, the killings of Black youth. It became about the riot and what properties were destroyed. And we've seen this over and over again, even in the US. So it is critical that we pay attention to those issues. I think definitely a riot begins where dialogue ends. And if dialoguing, because people do not just wake up one day and decide I'm going to the streets to riot. They have tried dialogue, they have tried persuasion, they have tried everything. And when they have been pushed to the wall, because we have a right to exist. People have a right to exist in spaces. Everybody here on earth has a right to exist somewhere. And we are not here by accident. When I think about the geopolitics of where people are located in the globe, I think of the people. I'm from an African country myself. I migrated here as an adult. And I can think of so many people who have almost a license to come into those countries, into African countries, without a single thought of whether they would be denied a visa or entry. Here, there is so much violence associated with immigration of people who look like me, that it is psychologically, emotionally, financially, intellectually, forms of violence that are perpetrated against us. So again, the reason why people would be denied spaces of protest is because they are not meant to be here. They are not perceived as people who should be here. But the question again of who should be here is also debatable, because even people who should be here still have violence perpetrated against them. I'm thinking about the I Don't Know More movement, people who are protesting on their own lands and still had violence perpetrated against them. So we cannot divorce this issue from issues of power and the fact that power is not going to be given willingly. And the only option there is really is to, if it comes to a riot, let it be. Because that is the only option left. I think I totally agree with everyone else. I am always squirming about the issue of the use of the word allyship. And when I think about it, I think of issues of cooptation. I think of issues of how conniving racism and colonialism is, and how it morphs into different stages to diffuse any form of resistance. So I totally agree. Riots are absolutely necessary. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Wambui. So many excellent additions to the conversation. Thank you very much for that. So we have one last question. We recognize that we're over time. So for anybody who needs to go, please feel free to do that. For those who can stay, we welcome you to continue sharing space with us. So all of our departments that have organized this event are departments that are supposed to be centered on practices of care, right? As social work departments, as schools of public health. And so there's so much of this work that takes a toll on our communities. But Black life, racialized life is not all about suffering, right? So I think one of our ending question is a good question to kind of reflect on that. And we'll ask this question to our panelists. However, we encourage those who are here to put their response in the chat. So the question is, where do you find joy? Right? What is your vision for Black futures? And so for that, we'll return to Wambui, who has just taken us off the last question, but go ahead and start us off on that.
Wow, where do I find joy?
Where do you find
I think for me, apart from the usual, cliche, I find joy from my family and my friends. I really find joy in relationships that affirm my humanity. That is where I feel most settled. I also find joy in places where I'm most rooted. I'm thinking of a little kid, a Black kid from Kenya, where I come from, who had a t-shirt. He was wearing a t-shirt that said, I don't need therapy, I just need to go to Kenya. And so that for me spoke volumes that, most of the times all the things that are in our minds are medicalized, or they are made to feel like they are diseases, when all we need is a safe place, is to go to a happy place. So that happy place for me is where I feel most rooted, and that's where I find the most joy. I remember the first time I went to Kenya after I had been here for many, many years and had no hope of ever going back because of the reasons I had come here. I felt like kissing the ground and I felt like saying, I'm home. So I find joy in home and whatever, however I define it. And I think speaking of my friends, I've had so many people, have the same sentiments. I think when we talk of Black futures, I was thinking I've thought about Black futures because it's part of my study. My thesis is also addressing issues of Black futurities. And for me, I define it as a stepping back, as a way of going back and imagining, having this imaginary of what life would have been, of what could have been if the disruption had not occurred. What trajectories would our lives have taken if colonial disruptions and whiteness and whatever did not visit upon us? If white did not descend on us. So the question is, how do we get to that place where we can safe enough, we feel rooted so that we can actually dream our futures? And how do we get to that place? And for me, as an Indigenous scholar, that place comes from my own Indigenous identity, which is really indestructible. It's a very, very strong place to draw from or to start imagining a new future for myself. I think there are going to be, of course, there has been a lot of corruption of what myself is at this point. I'm also very much implicated in the colonial project and in whatever. We are all very implicated, but I have to find my center. I have to go back there so that I can imagine what my future would have been. I think the challenges that come is that the Eurocentric notions and what has happened to us is so pervasive that we are not even able to dream. But the future that is the now that we have is not the only option that could have been, There are so many nows that could have happened that do not look like what is here today. So imagining Black futurity is the possibility of imagining a new humanity for me that is not bound up with the issues that have caused so much harm to ourselves, to our bodies, our psyches. It is getting away from all theories, neoliberal theories of enlightenment, of modernity and universalist, Eurocentric notions of whatever. Getting away from that, divesting ourselves of, trying to work to divest ourselves. And the only way that we can do that actually is to remain rooted in that which is indestructible in us and guided by spirit. So that is how I envision Black futurities. And then imagining what it could be, because Europe and Eurocentricity and colonialism are not the only story. They are a little part of a story, but it has been amplified through power and whatever to appear like it's the only story. There are other stories and other histories that we can be able to dream, and not just dream, imagine and create. Because creating, we have to not only imagine them, but to create them in our own, in our own way. So one of my professors has talked about the power of social theory. And he says that we have to move our theorizing to action. And it is having that action that is indigenized, that is going to push us to the future we want. It's going to be, again, a mess utopia. There's going to be resistance. But I think if we start from that place of being rooted within our own selves, within our own authentic selves, which really is not conquerable. That has never been conquered. So we can, if we started there and moved from there, propelled ourselves from there. And I drew from the West African theory of Sankofa, like it's like a going back. We have to go back and imagine what could have been, and then start imagining a Black futurity that does not center Europe, that where Europe is not a factor, because we were there and we will be there. And the fact that we are actually alive is a testament to the fact that we are indestructible. So we have futures to create. And that is how I imagine we moving forward, reclaiming our beings, first of all, from the onslaught of what has happened, and being very mindful of the necropolitics. And from necropolitics, I'm borrowing from Achille Bebe's theories of the term. And then reclaiming our knowledges, our epistemologies. Language, like Teneo said, is very powerful. It has been used to define and redefine us. But we do have indigenous languages. We have our own languages, our own spiritualities that we can draw from. And I think the moment you start divesting yourself and seeing yourself as to decolonize that part of yourself, then you have already started creating that Black future you want for yourself. And I think it becomes a collective effort when we all start feeling that way. And I think that is the law. That's where, I don't want to go back to the educational system, because I don't, the educational system is the way to go, although it can be decolonized to be that. But I think that work is already happening it should happen in our communities. And it has always happened. It is there. We just need to invoke it and see what it is that we can create. I think it's about creating those futures that are away from the fabrications of what the West has defined us as, and then affirming our existence on Earth.
Thank you. And so I would say that Simon and Jessica, feel free to add to the chat what your vision is. And I'll take Teneo as the last answer to this question before we move into our Q&A. Thank you.
So first question, joy.
Where do you find joy?
I find joy. I'm finding joy right now listening to Wambui. I'm getting all kinds of joy. And so that's the first thing. Connecting with other radical, revolutionary, liberatory energies brings me a lot of joy, because what it does, it contextualizes hope in Africanness, because I do think hope is a tool of supremacy. But so that brings me joy. And then, from a cliche standpoint, besides family, I cook, and specifically I build. And so I find joy in building. So I do everything from drying the garlic to making the vinegar to I build and I think. And that's one of the ways that I connect with my my African roots. Is just exploring those ingredients and unpacking and pulling and figuring out their journey and how they became what they became through colonization as well. So that is something that brings me joy, is digging into that and just having fun, and connecting with things that I guess the things that whiteness always co-opts, the music and the dance, and so that brings me joy. And my work actually brings me joy, as difficult as it might be, because when I get to hear from those students and how it's impacted them, absolutely. And then Black Futures, African Futures, I'm working through that one, because right now I'm excavating Black. Black does not exist without white. And so are we talking about Black futures, or are we talking about African futures? Those are two things for me. But I don't know, as full descendancy of colonization, so descendant of enslavement, I don't know if I have access to an African future. I don't know if my Blackness exists without whiteness, right? So I think I'm looking for Black futures. And for that, for me, a part of that means is, how do I connect to things that have been robbed of me but exist in my African blood memory, and how do we pass that on to future generations of Blackness and Africanness? So I think about that for my son, is how will he be rooted, and how will he find those roots, because he's a descendant of migration. I've migrated here from space, so where's his roots? So for me, Black futures are future generations being able to access their roots by their own choice and admission, because we do have plants that have been forcibly planted, right? So Black futures for me is being able to plant where you want to grow, and not take from that spot, but that is a spot that you are meant to be. Just thinking about space and the difference between representation and taking up space. So not the same thing. You can represent and not hold space. And so Black futures is about holding space, taking space, and it being there for you. That all of those privileges of whiteness are Black future. The privilege to be unbothered, the privilege to rest, the privilege, like that's the future for me.
That's beautifully put. And coming from a health background as well, we talk about being concise, right? And the need for being concise. And I have always said that, when something can't survive translation, it's because it was never meant to, right? It was meant to be brought through conversation and actual engagement with each other. And so what you're doing, I think, with the idea of Black and African, kind of negotiating that for yourself, and then through yourself for others, is actually kind of, again, resisting that white supremacist notion of everything needs to be concise and everything needs to be simplified or melted down to a single point, right? In some of my work, I've written kind of about, this idea that Africa has always had to be static, that we always have to go back to that place to then be rooted in Africanness, but life has happened, right? And so if we take then where we are as a new starting point for an extension of Africa in the ways that it now presents, what does that offer us, right? To go forward and to create futures that are not considered divorced, right? Or broken lineages, but rather new starting points for an extension of the people that we are. And what Wembuyu talks about that indestructible center, right? What does your body know about those histories? And what has your body now made in new places, right? What has your spirit now made in new places? So thank you so much for those contributions. So to our audience who have also made wonderful contributions and have participated so beautifully in the chat, thank you for that. I'll turn to some of your questions. So in terms of allyship, Simon, you first brought up the fact that you don't like that term, and everybody has kind of agreed. So we'll take Simon's thoughts first on the notion of allyship, and then Jessica as well.
We might have like 4 different responses as to why we don't like, why we collectively don't like allyship. It could be 4 different chapters of a book.
I'm glad you don't like it.
Against allyship, a book, 4 different chapters. Allyship. So, you know, commonly used, right, the term ally in anti-racism work or in EDI work. I think it's premised on the assumption that a group which is experiencing some form of oppression experiences that form of oppression and diagnoses it and acts on it politically in ways that are unified. And if you look at police violence or anti-Black police violence, the movement to defund the police, you have a response from communities impacted by police violence, poor people, unhoused people, Indigenous communities, Black communities, responses that diagnose the problem differently and that see the remedies differently as well. So then for a white ally, to put ally in quotation marks, if the problem is diagnosed differently and the remedies politically are different, are the remedies a more diverse police force? We need to hire more Black officers? Do we need a Black police chief? Do we need to defund the police, or we need to abolish the police? The diagnosis and the political remedies for the problem of anti-Black police violence are very different. And they come from, because communities are not cults, people have different politics. So then for the white ally to be engaged in a struggle against anti-Black police violence, do they ally with what politics? Do they also take up the struggle to ensure that the police board has a more diverse, makes it a priority to hire more diverse officers to diversify the police? Or do they take up the struggle to defund the police and abolish the police, a more radical demand? So I prefer the term comrade because it locates me on the left. It locates me as an anti-racist, but as a socialist and anti-capitalist too. And therefore, the demands that I see emanating from the community that is experiencing that form of oppression that align with my politics as a socialist are the ones that I ally with, or the ones that I engage with. So I'm not looking for my more diverse police force. I don't think that's going to give us bring an end to anti-Black police violence, police brutality. But I do see defunding the police and eventually abolishing the police as a solution, right? So in that sense, I'm a comrade, because that's a broader radical left-wing demand and not a more liberal demand.
And I think there's many terms for that. George Day calls them critical friends, right? Saying that ally is with you as long as it's suitable, right? The ally for this particular cause. However, a critical friend doesn't have to be engaged in your cause or agree with your cause, but they're critically engaging in the issue, kind of as you are experiencing, defining, and looking at it. So Jessica, how about for you? Why does an ally work? What might work in kind of in another vein?
I don't know if I have too much more to offer. What's been said so far is really meaningful. I find that the term allyship is very paternalistic. It sort of conveys this image of patting people on the head and saying, here, I'm here to support you, but then only if it doesn't get to a point where I feel discomfort, or further, if I don't lose power myself. So I think that allyship is a very centrist and liberal term, and it works to recenter white people to feel good about themselves, to say, you know what, I am an ally. I put my little post on Facebook or Twitter. I am an ally. Put it in my Twitter, in my bio. I'm an ally, and it works to make people feel better, white people feel better, I think. And I agree with everything, Simon, you just said about the term comrade. It has more of a politicized connotation. And I think that the last thing I want to say is thinking about praxis and allyship. I'm reading the book Abolition Feminism Now If folks haven't, you can see that I've earmarked like every single page, so not really sure why I did that, because the whole book is just so filled with this beautiful genealogy of abolition and feminism together. But their definition of abolition feminism praxis is politically informed practice. And I think that when we think about allyship, I don't think allyship fully gets to that place of politically informed practice. I think that allyship is a very light version of anti-racist praxis, so like anti-racism light. And that's sort of, we're not going for reform, we're going for abolition, we're going for liberation, we're going for Indigenous sovereignty, and allyship won't get us there. We need more engagement than that.
Thank you. And so the next question we'll direct to Neil. And it comes from the discussion of EDI complexes, industrial complexes, and kind of, the EDI world, what that looks like. And, just as you mentioned, just as a consultant myself, like all the things that you see and kind of the way that it's taken up, some companies will be hiring an EDI director. And I'm like, why are you hiring the EDI director when you knew nothing about this work, right? So maybe talk about a little bit about that complex and kind of how you see it playing out, and what are the uses perhaps of some of that EDI work, and what are the solutions to actually making it kind of go where it really needs to go.
I'll tell you something about this. The supremacy. It loves a complex. I mean, it builds a complex every time it gets a chance. This is something that I wrestle with, because I've seen a lot of Black women finally get their coins through the EDI industrial complex and create space. And I've seen, people get into that representation and start to push at some doors. And, when Bui talks about power and resources, and to kind of shake that power and get a couple coins out, get a couple resources to throw, to send out. So there's the challenge of the industrial complex is that it will give you some stuff that will keep you hanging on to that. I'll say one of the things that I'm beginning to recognize as, I guess in some spaces, a consultant who kind of says, this is not what I do. Thanks for reaching out to me, but that's not what I do. Is that some of those clients are now coming back and realizing, oh, actually, you're right. What we actually need is social justice. We don't need, equity, diversity, and inclusion. We need to understand how the structures are built and how we shift those structures and actually create space. So I think, for me, I don't think we're going to dismantle that complex anytime soon, because I think it is a complex that has always existed, but it's gotten a new name. There's always been a group of people who a position was created to bring them into the space. And then you will see that they're in other spaces where they're avoiding the language. So they're hiring people, talent, and culture, and people experience director, and talent recruiter. I'm like, what are these things? And so you see the repropertizing of people, and so I think there was a company that had a huge announcement that they were getting rid of the resume. I think it was a bank, like Scotiabank. They're getting rid of the resume so that more people have access to getting into the roles. This is their big EDI pitch. And I'm looking at this thing, I'm like, but it's a big EDI pitch in the university. And we've said that in these spaces, we have fewer representation. So you're having access to fewer Black, Indigenous, racialized, disabled talent. And so they've removed the resume in a white space to increase white diversity, or to make it, I'm like, this doesn't make sense. And so the only way we're going to shift that system is actually to get away from this game of playing with the language. Because the entire thing is structured for white comfort. White people don't want to be uncomfortable. And so they've created an entire concept. They don't, to the point that they don't even say the words, and they, there's DEI and EDI, and now there's ready. So they've just dropped reconciliation onto the front. So we're just, so it's all acronyms now, and read and ride. And it's just, how many fun ways can we say this thing that is about justice and liberation. So sometimes I just want to be like, you cannot have equity when you have a corporate room of 360 white men who go, I did not know this history about Canada. I cannot believe that this happened in Canada. This has been so informative to me. And then they just leave the room feeling something, but I don't know what they felt. And the last thing I'll say about the industrial complex is if you want to break it, it starts in the school. Because the EDI complex begins in the school system. The same white person that was holding all the power is the same one that's holding all the power in the corporate space. So if you want to actually not need that industrial complex, you need to start in JK. You start a daycare. That's how we're going to break the back of the EDI industrial complex.
Absolutely. I was just, you know, trying not to roar of laughter right now because someone typed in Jedi and I'm like, I'm a big anything stars. That's where you find me. So, you know, when someone said Jedi, so not Jedi, not the Force, but exactly all of these new acronyms, right? That just hide the actual, like dealing with the actual problem, dealing with the actual issues, right? And the one I have recently been puzzling over is the addition of A for access, but I'm like, if you don't have equity part, then you're not gonna get access. So you're just planting access on the end tells me that you didn't understand all the other letters in the first place, right?
Idea, that's what you get.
Yeah, so it might sound cute, but are you doing the work that makes it kind of, you know, rough and tumble and more scrappy than it looks, right? So thank you so much, everyone. As you said, Neil, it has been a joy to be in conversation with everyone here today. Thank you, Simon, and extending that thank you also to Adil for your work on the film. Thank you, Jessica, for your work in the prison systems as well, incarceration, and bringing light to those issues, as you say, they're very real ones. And then Tanil and Wimbuyi, your work in community, your work in education, brilliant work there. Thank you to Audrey, who introduced our session today. Audrey, come back on camera. Let us all clap for you. Well done, well done, well done. And then to Amila and to Ryan, who are hiding in the background, they can also come on camera so we can give them a round of applause. Don't leave me hanging now, come on camera. Round of applause, round of applause. Thank you, everyone. Oh, Mila has no camera, but you can see.
I'll unmute myself. The hijab came off, so camera stays off. But thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much. This was fantastic. And I'm sure we could have gone well past even the additional half hour that we stayed on. So thank you for those who stayed on and to our panelists as well.
Yes. So the session is recorded. So we'll be communicating about where to find that. Oh, thank you for the thank yous about the hosting. Lovely, lovely. So everyone have yourselves a wonderful, peace-filled evening. And may you go with joy in whatever work that you do. Take care.